We're live now. Welcome to Hangout number 20.
Number 20!
That many already?
Yeah, the default view on my screen is always Daniel, though. I don't know. If nobody's talking, it's always full screen Daniel.
That's funny, because mine's always you. Aww.
There's a connection there.
Mm-hmm. So, what shall we start with, Geek and Geekettes?
Whatever you guys want.
Well, let's talk about the serious stuff first.
Let's say, shall we start with the short? Well, how about we start with the category thing, because I think that will be over and done with pretty quickly, and then we can move on to a longer discussion.
Yeah, just to see where everybody stands.
Yeah. Okay, just to get some context what we're talking about, basically the author of the book nailed David Fitzgerald. Is it that Fitzgerald, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's been in conversation with the editors of Wikipedia, having backwards and forwards, and apparently Wikipedia has officially decided, according to his Facebook post, to label the Jesus myth theory / the Christ myth theory as multiple things, including fringe theory, pseudoscience, pseudo-history, all these sorts of interesting, shall we say, category choices. Naturally, Fitzgerald is quite upset about this, and as people on the Bible Geek forum, Facebook forum, are quite passionate and divided over this. Shall we open the conversation up there?
I'm not passionate.
Yeah, me neither.
I'm always just even keel anyway.
It's a good way to be.
Yeah, no ulcers, no health problems, nothing. Yeah, perfectly healthy, 53 years, nothing wrong.
For me, sorry, you go first.
Well, I was following a lot of different editing wars going on Wikipedia for a lot of years. From whatever I happened to be into at the time. I've never actually participated in them, but I've followed them with interest. And I have to say that there's a lot of catering to various biases on Wikipedia.
Oh, yeah.
And just like in the movie King of Kings, when Barabbas asks how come he got let off and not Jesus, the centurion tells me, your followers shouted the loudest. So it's that they're very noisy crowd that gets their way in just about any situation on the internet in general, but a lot of times in Wikipedia's editing and discussion forums.
Hence why I will not be surprised if this gets changed within a fortnight. I will not bat an eyelash.
Is it official yet? I mean, have they? I mean, they've officially decided. It sounds like, but have they actually gone ahead and reclassified it on all the relevant articles?
I do not know. It sounds like they've decided. Whether they've changed it or not, similar to John, I kind of didn't care enough to kind of really follow it. I was more interested in following the eruption on Mount Geek on Facebook. So, yeah.
Well, considering it's a mecca of mythicists,
Yeah.
it's to be expected.
Yeah.
I personally think it's a little unfair to consider it pseudo.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's undeniably a fringe proposition, but I don't think it's, and there's so many different varieties of Christ mythicism. I mean, just like there's so many varieties of the historical Jesus, there's as many or more mythical Christs, and some are way more out there than others, I think.
That's exactly what John and I and David were discussing before we went live, where there's plenty of pseudo-historical Jesus theories out there, and there are plenty of pseudo-mythicist theories out there. However, just the term pseudo, theory, the whole thing, I think that's a bit too far. I would agree, but it is undeniable that it's a fringe theory, um, or at least if you want it to be nicer, a minority theory.
Yeah.
Um, John suggested the term alternative theory, but I have problems with that. Did you want to explain why you liked alternative, John?
Oh, because I'm an old timer.
Old
Back,
timer.
yeah, back in the days before there was a web, when there was just like Usenet and Gopher and stuff like that. On Usenet, whenever they would start forums on Usenet, JFK assassination, something like that. But people that were in it, some of the more fringe people had different ideas, but they weren't, they were being ridiculed, they were being attacked and stuff. So they started forming what they called the alt system on Usenet, where you would have alt JFK assassination, alt this or that. So that's kind of where I was coming from. The first thing that occurred to me, because of my background, was like an alternative type of scholarship. Because terms like, as Daniel said, pseudo, and Doug said pseudo, is very loaded term to use. So, and it's blanket, like I said.
Yeah, it's a bit too blanket, and it's more the blanket thing that I have a problem with. Um, yeah, I guess my problem with alternative is like the example I used before, Mark Goodacre's theory, the Bauer-Gulda theory, not the Bauer, the Gulda Ferrer Goodacre theory against Q. To me, that's an alternative theory to the synoptic problem. And the reason why I think that is an alternative theory is because it has enough attention, enough notice, and enough criticism for it to be, quote unquote, worthy, end quote, to be classified as alternative. Whether the Christ myth theory to me is so minority, like it's like a blip on the radar for most people. So, and I'm not saying that in an assaulting way. That's just the reality of the situation that it's in. So, yeah.
It's also your various perspectives where you're coming from, because if you look at a list of scholars, I would kind of I feel sorry for all these scholars that would then be classified as pseudo scholarship, and some really brilliant thinkers going back hundreds of years, were they alive today, they'd be very upset that they would be considered fringe scholars, because at that time,
Yeah, and
they were considered more mainstream and more,
and that's another reason why I have a problem with it, because like someone like Bruno Bauer, where like definitely by today's standards has some crazy theories, but at the time like there was nothing fringe about him until he lost his job. He was a university professor.
but then he
So
started hanging out with Bible geeks, and
well, it's more that he started hanging out with Marx, I think. So, or
yeah,
Marx started hanging out with him. But
he
yeah,
needed the
like
money.
so, there's definitely a history and a tradition to this theory that is pretty well attested within the academy. Not so much anymore. Not at all anymore, really. So I don't know. I think we
I
can
think it's
all.
making a comeback, and a lot of times this is a reaction. There's a lot of certain things that start popping up, that try to put roadblocks in the way when people feel threatened by even resurgence of ideas or new ideas. So
Yeah, I hate to burst the geeks bubbles, but I just, and I know I say this as an historicist, but I just don't think we're ever going to see a resurgence. I think what I'm more interested in is I think the popularity of the Christ myth theory is so much more embedded with the energy in the new atheist movement than it is in academic circles. And things that we're doing right now, like the Hangouts, the forums, the blogs, the Facebook pages, like that's where the real energy is. And some of the conversations we have, I'm blown away. Like I was not challenged by people like I am on my blog and on the Facebook group than in some of my undergraduate classes at a college. So right there, I'm really impressed. But I think some people like to feed this idea that like all it will take is a few good books and then the universities will change. You know, they'll come crawling to us, and I'm like, I think that's a fantasy you're living in there. But that's my opinion.
Well, some people do think that way. I don't think that way because I just think that it deserves to be taken more seriously. But I'm not saying that it's ever going to replace the other
Yeah, yeah.
paradigm.
Well, and that's where I agree. Where I think it needs to be taken seriously, but I just don't. For all the reasons I've talked about before, I just don't see it replacing the paradigm.
And you brought up some good points about a lot of these things ride a wave of popularity in the
Oh
public
yeah,
consciousness. But that stuff fades away, and what you're
only
left
to
with
come
is the
back
core.
again.
Yeah, you always though left with a core of people that are very serious about it. That it's not for them a weapon because they hate Jesus and they hate religion, and it's another tool to bring down Christianity or something. But they're trying to study it to get a more scholarly view of what it can tell us. And that happens a lot in different ways. A lot of paradigms are shifted that way because, they rode a popular wave, but there was substance to it that when the wave finally crashed, it was smaller but much more refined and much more potent as far as what
Yeah.
changes it does make.
Well, you look at the whole Jesus being married thing. That it just raises its ugly head in waves all the time. And I think the Jesus myth theory does the same thing. It has these waves and there's these different things. But what I find really fascinating about this new wave is the internet has always played an integral part to the Jesus myth theory, but now it's playing not always, but the internet has always been a bastion for it, but now I feel like the tectonic plates are shifting as bloggers are getting so much more vocal and attention, and it's really changing the dynamics. And where I'm really interested at SPL next year, James McGrath, who's a very, he love him or hate him, or however you feel about him, he's blogging and he's engaging with the public on this podium, and people listen and comment and disagree with him and fight with him and praise him. And all of these different scholars are really getting into blogging, and it's really changing the whole way we interact. And SBL next year is actually hosting a conference on biblioblogging, the Bible and blogging, like how blogging is changing the way we deal with the public and each other.
Oh,
So I'm
wow.
really excited to go to that.
Yeah, finally, 2015, geez.
Yeah, I know, right? But I'm working on a paper to give to it, so maybe James will let me speak on something.
There's another characteristic to modern technology is that in the past, a lot of these issues were raised but not pursued scholarly. They were let to bury. With the internet and technology, a lot of things just don't go away as easy, So things are
Yeah.
preserved, things are
Oh
very easily
yeah.
accessed. So it's not easy just to ignore it away into oblivion and wait for another wave to pop up. I think it's kind of here to stay, but I too would rather not see it just be some pop phenomenon, and have those characteristics.
What I find really interesting is on the group. Um, on the group, for example, people are so personal about it, and are really invested in it. And people have it for different reasons. And I think that's another big change we're sort of feeling, where people, whether it be Q or non-Q, who wrote Paul, are these things forgeries? Because like literacy has raised, reading has raised, and like you've said, John, the documents are out there for us to engage. Scholars are now engaging with popular books, and even just scholarly books themselves, I think, are getting easier and easier to read, which is great. So I feel like people are more invested in this, almost like football teams. It's like people invest in these theories, like we've got to get our team to the championship almost. Um,
Yeah, it does have its
yeah.
dark side too, where
Oh yeah.
people get
Well,
so emotionally involved that they chase away people that want to talk about it in a civilized manner, and it just degenerates into the worst possible human behavior you can imagine.
yeah. Well, it's sort of that's sort of what I found with before when we talk about Bruno Bauer and Albert Schweitzer and all these other great figures. They wrote these books, but who their students and their peers read them, but people like me and Doug and you, we wouldn't have time or the interest or the skill to be engaged in these sorts of debates, really. Would be off to the salt mines. Um, so just that has changed the dynamic. And on the one hand, that's really good. And I'm so happy that we do things like this where lay people come together and we duke it out and we get excited by the most geeky, Bible-y things. But on the other hand, I think the dark side of that is everybody's an expert now, which frustrates me to no end. And that's actually kind of what I want to write my paper on for James, that one of the problems, quote unquote, is everybody is an expert on the internet. So what does that mean for Bible scholarship in the future?
It means there are going to be a lot of pissed off scholars that have to interact with people that they normally wouldn't have to have given 10 seconds of their time to, which is already a complaint. Oh, I'm tired of people, bugging me with these questions about that.
Yeah. I get it though. Like I've only been doing this blogging thing for a little bit, and immediately I get a bit tired because it's like I get a few people. When are you going to write more on the Jesus myth theory? When are you going to write more on that? And I'm just like, I have interests outside it. Like I'm more interested in Marcion and Paul and the Gospel of Mark. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I've written about it. It clearly interests me, but I can't already. I kind of hear where they're coming from, John.
Yeah, and when you say that people think they're experts, they just don't realize how narrow their knowledge really is. We try to be as broad as possible. I mean, we read stuff we agree with, stuff we don't agree with,
Yeah,
stuff
exactly.
that would give us not one single farthing from the salt mine. We'd be a lot better working in
Well,
instead of
this is
spending time
why
doing this.
This is why I really like what Doug does. Getting you in here, Doug. I really like what you do on a Sunday with our own little reading group, and you're challenging people to read things they may not normally read in books in the Bible, books outside the Bible, scholars who that people may have never even heard of, topics that they've never even considered. I think it's a great initiative, Doug.
Yeah, it's one of the highlights of my week. And it's also, that people don't agree. You can read the same book and come away with different things, or you bring something to a book from your own experience or your own reading, and it makes for interesting conversations, especially about
Yeah.
pigs.
Oh yeah, the great pig controversy. We'll never settle that one.
What?
That's true.
You'll have to watch the Hangout.
Okay.
Yeah, either you watch the recording or you had to been there, but
Okay, sounds like it.
can't really summarize it in one word. Demiurge.
But
Well, I can summarize it. Basically, were pigs easy to raise in the highlands of Israel?
oh,
That's
uh,
that's what it all came down to.
I don't know.
We couldn't agree with that on
I don't
whether
know.
they were.
I know because I've read that pigs are difficult to raise. I had no issue with that. The issue I had was why would they suddenly stop, whereas their other fellow Highlanders were happy to eat pigs. So what's the reason? And a lot of
yeah.
the reasons were offered was, well, they're difficult. Well, yeah, but they would be difficult for everybody naturally.
Yeah, that's the whole kosher thing, that is I don't want to just do the escape rope and be like, oh, that's a really difficult topic, but if you picked up any like big fat introduction to the Old Testament, the whole like why did the Jews stop eating pigs all of a sudden? It's hard. Like it's
Yeah, we don't know.
so many people have written different theories about it. It is intense. Like it's such a simple question, but so much has been written on it.
I think what we read in this book was to me, one of the most convincing ideas. I mean, it's not definitive, but basically, because at the time they were still in that basically pastoral lifestyle, and pigs aren't conducive to that lifestyle. They can't travel as easily as sheep or goats.
Yeah, yeah.
They require more of a settled existence to raise pigs properly. And eventually, the Highland people in these pastoral roaming settlements or groups were looking down at the lowlands people, the Canaanites and Philistines, etc. And eventually this became like an ethnic distinctive.
Yeah, they eventually become the other because
Yeah, they're the pig eaters, we're not. And then it got what would you call
Codified.
it? Yeah, codified
yeah.
through the religion. I think that's very likely, but yeah, who knows? I mean, we just don't know. And there doesn't seem to have been any economic or ecological or health reasons why some particular highland areas stopped eating pigs.
Yeah, the health reason was knocked around for a long time, particularly in 20th century Protestant circles, but the evidence just doesn't support it. One of the other, I think this is a more of a 19th century theory, particularly when we get into like Darwinism and things like that. One of the theories which Christopher Hitchens, interestingly enough, purported in his book, God is Not Great, is that it's the screaming of the pigs, that the pigs, when they scream, sound so human-like. They stop doing it, but I don't buy that either.
Yeah, I don't buy that either.
Yeah, the trouble with the book we were reading, though, Bible on Earth, was that it was just a passing thing. It didn't go into any detail. So the argument was really based on what we knew apart from the book, and everybody heard different stuff, had different theories, read different things. So it became an interesting debate, but it really got off the topic of the book we were actually dealing with.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a really interesting debate. If it comes open again, I would definitely recommend Jacob Wright's Coursera course on the Bible's political future, because in week 4 he talked about I think it's in Egypt somewhere that they found Jewish burial grounds. And what was interesting is that pig remains weren't too far behind. So clearly these guys were bad Jews and things like that.
They didn't happen to be in the Delta, did they?
What's that?
The burials didn't happen to be in the Delta, did they? The Delta region of the Nile, Northern Nile.
I think so. Yeah.
Hyksos!
Well, there was an interesting collection of videos on YouTube by a Jewish scholar, and part of it was like 5-minute chops of his lecture, so you had to watch like 4 or 5 of these 5-minute things to get the whole discussion on the Hyksos. But he was talking about this theory that there was 2 Amorite empires. There's an Eastern Amorite Empire, which would include, Babylon in that area. Hammurabi was an Amorite. Then there was a Western Amorite Empire, and he said that that included the Minoan cities, that there was similarity in architecture between like Philistine and Egyptian architecture from the Hyksos period, similar to that Mycenaean type period, so that he thought that was all part of an Amorite kingdom. But I thought that Amorite theory of origins of these groups was like one of those long dead, passe type theories.
Amorite origin of what? Of the Hyksos people?
Yeah. Or even like the Philistines and all those related, because if the Philistines and the Phoenicians and the various sea peoples, whoever they were Amorites, then they were like Semitics and related to the Eastern Amorites, who were eventually took over the Fertile Crescent on the eastern side. So it's two separate empires, but basically the same peoples. Which I thought basing it just on the architecture alone, similarities of architecture and columns and stuff, was a little flimsy. But I had read something about the Amorite theory, and it's like I thought that was something that was abandoned a long time ago. But I must be the only one that ever heard of it.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that.
I'll have to look into that because I do have a little bit of spare time.
How far back are we talking?
Well, what would be the Hyksos period considered? That
Like
would be what, 17th, 13th? Okay.
13th century BC, I think.
Yeah, somewhere around there. That would be contemporary with the kingdom of Hammurabi, I would imagine. The Eastern Amorite Empire, which is considered valid, but I had never heard of a Western distinct Amorite Empire that was the basis of these massive migrations, that when that Amorite Empire fell due to whatever population pressures or famine or whatever, just people got bored or whatever, and they started, heading towards the eastern coast of the Mediterranean down into Egypt, that those were the same peoples, same Semitic peoples, and eventually they ended up as Hyksos in Egypt.
Sorry, I got my dates off. It looks like 16th, 15th, 16th, 17th century BC. You said you were right.
I said 17th, so a little bit
Yeah,
early.
somewhere in there. Although it says they first appeared, there's the earliest evidence of Canaanite populations appearing in Egypt are as early as the 12th dynasty, around the 19th century BC.
Yeah, I read that too somewhere. There was like a constant infiltration and movements of these people in and out. Anyway.
Yeah, and they talked about that in the book too. Like they think famine, like regular famines, kind of drove people down into Egypt, out of Canaan.
Yeah, a lot of the weather patterns and anywhere is kind of cyclical. If you're looking at hundreds or even thousands of year periods, it does seem to have a repeat pattern: drought, good times, bad times, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to see a lot, and that's what they were talking about for the origin of the highland people that eventually became the Israelites and their cousin peoples. This cycle is going on for quite a while. It allowed good pastoral living, so they lived off in the desert. As desert for pasteurizing, I should say, kind of deteriorated, and they had to move into the highlands in order to start, supplementing their diet with agrarian type produce. That these were cycles that repeated. It just at one point, because of the sudden collapse of the lowland Canaanite cities, that for the first time presented the Highlanders with an opportunity to expand in a new way, become more settled, take over some of those lowland territories.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, I'm really loving that book. Anyway, do you guys care if we shift gears? It's not totally shifting gears, but it's related to the mythicism thing a little bit.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Specifically, the some of the historical criteria that are used.
Criteria.
Yeah, like I was thinking earlier today about one in particular, the multiple attestation. Do we consider the Gospels independent sources? So, like for example, all four of them attest to the cleansing of the temple. Are those four independent? Is that multiple attestation, or are they literally codependent on each other, or do they all stem from some original trunk of oral tradition?
Depends which scholar you read. Basically, people in this group, for example, that would say that, I dare say, let me just preface that, people who would say things like, well, for example, Luke and Matthew are independent of each other, but they use Mark, for example. So if something is in both Matthew and Luke, but it's not in Mark, that could, but it's also in John, for example, and John's by himself. Aha, that's independent then, clearly. Or something like if something is in Paul, John, and the Synoptics, if they all share it in common, oh, that's independent, therefore it's more likely to be historical. Most scholars would say if it only happens in the Synoptics, for example, because Mark is so much of the basis of the Synoptics, that's not enough to be independent. It depends, because some scholars argue different synoptic ways to solve the synoptic problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, what you're talking about, multiple independent attestation, it's one of the reasons why it's so problematic, because what do you classify? Like, a classic example is, which I didn't think about until later, but the cleansing of the temple, for example. The cleansing of the temple is in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, on the one hand, because I am I follow the Farrer hypothesis that Mark wrote first, then copied Matthew, then copied Mark, and Luke copied from Matthew. That's not independent. That's all the same story. But because I think John is most likely independent, oh, he has a cleansing story of the temple, so they're independent and they both have Jesus cleansing the story. But then when I started thinking about it, I'm like, well, but it's a completely different version of the story. Like, it's at the beginning, not at the end. And
Yeah.
all that. So how much does the criteria really help and things like that? So it's one of the reasons why it's one of the more stickier ones people have a problem with. Not because the actual theory in itself is a problem, because in any sort of good historical stuff, if different people report the same thing independently, yeah, sure, it's all likelihood that raises its chances of really happening in a sense. But then we don't really have those sorts of sources now, do we?
Yeah, exactly. And do you put much stock in like Boltmann's idea that John may not have used, like, for example, when he was sitting down and composing his gospel, he might not necessarily have had copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, all three, or maybe just one of them, sitting there on his desk while he was composing his own. But Boltmann argued that there's obvious stuff in John's gospel that seems to be deliberate correction of some of the synoptic stuffs, like the Garden of Gethsemane scene, the Jesus carrying his own cross, etc.
Yeah.
It seems to be correcting synoptic stuff.
Well, what's really interesting is John, if you look at like how scholars feel about John's relationship to synoptics, it's pretty much down the line 50-50. It's really interesting. Johannine independence or reliance is pretty much 50-50. Scholars go back and forth. And I'm one of those people, because similar to Boltzmann, he has a lot of stuff that is so similar to Mark and Matthew, for example. Particularly the role of the Jews. It has very similar stuff in Matthew, how wicked the Pharisees are and things like that. And also the temple theology, and how Jewish in its own right John is. It's similar sort of temple Jewish messianic stuff to Matthew, but things like that.
Wouldn't you say that John's gospel framework is pretty much Markan, even though it doesn't have the same incidents and same?
That's one of the reasons why someone like Crossan, for example, he thinks the framework is so Markan in its narrative. That's why he thinks he has Mark. Boltmann, as Doug pointed out, that basically the Kema, the core Jesus material, John is aware of it. John is aware of the core Kema of Jesus tradition and sayings and things like that. but then reinterprets them and reuses them as he pleases for his own,
That's
poetic gospel.
Kerygma.
Yeah.
Well, what I'm getting at is, if, to me, I haven't studied a lot. I'm a huge amateur, but from what I've heard of what Boltmann's arguing, that seems pretty convincing. That he's at least familiar with it.
Yeah, pretty much everybody would say he's familiar with Jesus' tradition.
Yeah.
Whatever.
So
he's not inventing it out of whole cloth.
So my question is, to what extent is it legitimate to use John as an independent source versus the Gospels?
Yeah, that's another big problem that people fight over. How historical is John and things like that. And why is John included in the sources, but like things like Thomas aren't, and there's all that sort of stuff.
Well, what's interesting too is versus the Synoptics, John seems to have a much more overtly theological agenda.
Yeah, that's the big problem. Everyone since Schweitzer has basically had that problem with John. That it's so obvious that John has a theological motive. That's why people just don't really use John at all. Even conservative evangelical scholars, they try and tiptoe around it, but they just don't use John.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious. It's way different. But I was wondering because, there's these things scholars talk about, these minimal facts. Like, Jesus cleansed the temple. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He was somehow, related in some way to, I don't mean like blood related, but his ministry was somehow related to John the Baptist.
Yeah.
All these minimal facts. But to me, it seems like multiple attestation is maybe useful, but it seems like it's resting on shaky ground to some extent.
And I agree. It's useful, but it's resting on shaky ground. I think that's a really good way of putting it. And I have no problem with the things you've laid out. Those minimal facts are minimal for a reason. There's not many of them. So.
Yeah. And the other one too was the principle of embarrassment.
Embarrassment, yeah.
That one I never quite got. In some cases it seems more clear than others, but like one of the shiny examples that Ehrman uses is Jesus' baptism by John.
Yeah.
That's embarrassing somehow.
Therefore, it's more likely historical. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so I don't know. I guess those ones. Does it seem like in Mark's gospel that it's embarrassing? I'm not sure. It seems like some of the later evangelists seem to be embarrassed by it. Especially John.
That's the new problem with the embarrassment criteria. That a few people have brought up. Well, hold on. Who are we to say what's embarrassing and what's not? Mm-hmm. Because if we look at Mark doesn't seem embarrassed by it. Not at all.
It's almost like John's passing on the baton.
Yeah, exactly. Like, so that's not an issue, and that's honestly, it's things like that has made me reconsider it. But honestly, something like the crucifixion, for example, like that. Look, people like Carrier, for example, can talk their way out of that as much as they want, but to me that's embarrassing. Like, everybody finds that somewhat embarrassing unless they transform it to the crux of their theology. So, the baptism I can buy as being unembarrassing, but the crucifixion I can't. That's so obviously historical to me, and one of the reasons why I find it to be historical is because of that embarrassment criteria. It just makes the most sense to me.
Yeah. Though, what do you think of, some people have said that, well, it's embarrassing to the extent that certain groups didn't have like a martyr theology behind it already. You know what I mean?
No, I don't know. I don't know what you mean.
Were you reading that McGrath? Oh no, wait, yeah, McGrath article on that new Jesus mythicist book by that journalist, that Root guy,
What?
or was it? Oh no, it was about
Um,
that was about Raphael Latester, I think.
yeah, yeah. Well,
Okay.
Lancaster's article points out all the stuff. Basically, he just repeats all the problems Carrier has with improving history with the criteria stuff, which most people, like a lot of people, have pointed out lately. Like what's his name? Porter, Sydney Porter's particularly pointed out, and Zebra Crook, and yeah, people like Crook, for example, think that we're entering in a new no quest period. And for those of you who don't know, the no quest was that period in the 70s and 80s that basically, oh, not the 70s and 80s, it was earlier than that. In the 20s, I think, that basically no one really quested for Jesus because it was all seen to be quite in vain to get back to a historical figure of Jesus. So a few people like Porter and Crook think we're getting back into that at the moment. That we need to go back to the drawing board, as it were.
Daniel, how are you doing on time?
I can stay a little bit longer because it's getting late here.
Because, you
Well,
know, if you want to just keep discussing this, that's fine. You know, I have no problem with that.
No, I'm happy to talk criteria. I have my problems with it, but I think it's useful. I think some people have overblown just how problematic it is. Some of them are problematic, some of them are, I think, useful. I think still. Like embarrassment. I still think the embarrassment criteria helps us understand things in a certain way, to a certain extent.
yeah, I agree with that for sure. The martyr thing I was talking about is there seems to have been a development in late but pre-Christian Judaism about the suffering servant idea. And the
Yeah.
suffering servant was revered and respected even though he underwent, you know, embarrassing,
Yeah, yeah.
undignified, degrading suffering, you know. So that doesn't seem too foreign, is what I'm saying. But yeah, I
It's
agree
not
that
foreign. It's not foreign, but if you look at it, it's always on the fringes. Like 9 out of 10 times when people are picking their theology at that period, they're picking mighty warrior theology. Like the suffering servant theology is pretty much always a reaction to defeat or loss. Where it's like, how do we understand this catastrophe? Oh, it's God's will, you know. And the suffering servant fits into that perfectly. So it's not foreign to them, and clearly not because they use it in their own theology to understand the death of Jesus. But I think that's the point. The catastrophe happens, and then they have to understand why it happens.
yeah, so they use
Yeah,
they use this idea to interpret Jesus' death.
yeah, and it's not foreign because other people have talked about it, like the prophets suffer and other holy men suffer, and it's the will of God. It's the will of the God of Israel. So it's not foreign to them, but when you look at like the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Qumran set and other, you know, Josephus, you know, it's there, but people much prefer, you know, let's take over and kick out the Romans. Yeah, they prefer that clearly in their apocalyptic language.
Now, what do you think about the same idea? I mean, that's the Jewish take as a reaction to some tragedy, some way to rationalize what happened theologically. How
Yeah,
do you see it fitting in with like you were talking about that book you were reading, Jesus Deus, where
yeah.
the whole Mediterranean dying and rising God
Well, he
framework?
doesn't get into that, like,
Oh,
because
okay.
yeah, because the dying and rising God thing isn't. It's not a thing. Like it's really not a thing. Not to the extent we think it is. Yeah, he does write about it. Littler does write about it a little bit about like somewhat resurrection story, like return stories, I think is what the phrase he uses. But it's not like, oh, there's a mold here that it has to fit. It's more that the imagery is still, people know about it. Still people know about heroes going to death and then returning. So at least psychologically, they can kind of understand what's going on.
So it doesn't have the status of a mytheme like the way we would understand that. A very powerful social model.
Yeah, but basically, like, it's not. Litwa's thesis is much more like there's definitely these models and traits that people within the ancient Mediterranean would have understood, but it's not like Christians had a sushi train and just picked what traits they liked and then appropriated them to Jesus. That's not his thesis.
Yeah, it sounds like a really good book because it reminded me of Parables of War that we read on Sunday Meet.
Yeah,
Where it was totally
it is a great
unexpected. It's we were expecting it to be like, okay, we have discovered the core Jewish essence of Revelation, and it turned out to be very far from that. It's a totally different take on it.
Yeah, it's totally not like that. It was what I loved about the book, and I've been emailing Whitwer ever since, actually, back and forth. And I don't know, if we read it, we might be able to get him onto a Hangout. He seems like a really cool guy. Like, one of the chapters I really, really enjoyed was the virgin birth thing he writes about, where, basically one of the problems with scholarship is that scholars try to emphasize that, just like, oh, look how unique. Yeah, okay, there's these other divine birth stories in the Mediterranean, but look how unique Jesus is. Jesus' miraculous birth is so unique. And Litwa's thing is like, yeah, it has unique aspects, but the actual concept of divine birth is not foreign at all. Like, come on, let's be real. And it's like things like that I really like, that balancing act where it's like, yeah, it is interesting that it's a virgin conceiving and there's no vaginal sort of intercourse between a mortal woman and a god. Like, okay, that is interesting. But, angelic beings announcing his reign and sovereignty, well, that's not exactly uncommon. And people would have known what that meant. And, sure, Crossan and Borg are right that there's political aspects, but there's miraculous aspects too. Like, there's definitely things where it's like, this is a divine birth. The cosmos is halting what it does because the divine is getting involved. And the Mediterranean people would have understood that something supernatural is going on here.
If I may, could I interject on this?
Yeah, sure.
I think you're right. I mean, speaking from my perspective here, I would definitely agree with you. But there are some things that does make Christianity unique. It comes down less to the core mythos, I guess you could say, and more to how they interpret them. In the ancient world, in pretty much every other culture, they wouldn't have taken stories like that literally. But Christians do. And they've been progressively more literalist as the convening centuries drew on. And the church had several reforms after that, continuing on that sort of tradition. Even though there were examples of early Christian denominations in the very early church that didn't take it quite as literally, as evidenced by the Gnostics, by Marcions, and various other Jewish mystical groups in the area which had similar ideas to Christ. I just think it's important to point that out.
Yeah, and I don't see that as accidental. I think in contradistinction to groups that didn't take it literally, took it allegorically, took it mythically, in order to come out on top. But there was like a political game being played about which brand of Christianity is going to triumph. I think using the literal interpretation, the historical interpretation, was a very good way of establishing authority over other groups.
Absolutely. And just taking it very topically, the mythology associated with Dionysus, where he taught viniculture, which made him fairly distinct from Jesus, but there was definitely wine associated, obviously, with the sacramental nature of Christian theology. But more specifically, he was a figure that lived amongst men and was only revealed as being a god when he challenged the impious and deranged and depraved individuals in the countryside, which is a very similar story to Jesus. But the Greeks would have seen that as a sort of allegory to Dionysus's divinity and not as a literal kind of historical record of what Dionysus did on earth. Christianity sees that entirely differently.
I just do want to clarify that Marcion was not an allegorist. Marcion hated allegory. He was very much a literal person.
No, yeah, you're right. You're right. But I mean to say that there were elements of allegory in different levels. There was a sort of gradation of how much you take it literally, how much it's mythicist, how much it's a literal account of history. And there was constant back and forth arguments on which thing is to be taken literally and which is entirely symbolic.
Yeah.
So you had a question? You had a question, Doug?
Well, I was just thinking, in general, on the criteria thing, I was just thinking, like, it seems like while I personally think good evidence for historicity, but again, I'm just an amateur that doesn't really know that much. I think that there's enough room for something like mythicism to where it's not a pseudo thing, you know what I mean? Even though obviously there are people who say it's virtually certain that Jesus was a historical person, I don't think, say, scholars like Earl Doherty or Robert Price should be characterized as pseudo historians or whatever. That was where I was going with that whole big long line of going into the historical criteria, like.
Yeah, no.
But their scholarship goes a long way back. When Dr. Price talks about dissimilarity and things like that, we're talking about a long pedigree of scholarship, that developed, quite a long time ago. So, it's not just an affront, and you shouldn't take it emotionally. I mean, if somebody wants to characterize Dr. Price as a pseudo scholar, that would be kind of emotionally offensive to me. But trying to separate my emotions from my other opinions is that that's also characterizing a lot of really good scholarship that does make a lot of sense going way back as pseudo scholarship. And that's where I think they just need to back off. I'm not saying that they should totally change their mind, but I think they should just rethink it.
Well, I agree. I look, and I've said it before. I honestly don't understand. Like, it's sort of like that whole like eyes to see thing. I really just don't have the eyes to see what people like Price and Carrier and Doherty see. Like, I'm reading the exact same text as them. I'm listening to their arguments, but I just can't see what they see for XYZ reasons. But I would never categorize them as pseudo, and not amateur. Yeah, it's just it just goes like definitely minority, maybe fringe if you want to be careful with that language, but yeah.
Well, something that I've noticed, and once again, this kind of speaks to my experiences being outside of the sort of argument that typically goes with biblical scholarship. But I feel that it ends up, even when there are gradations that are being elucidated, that when you're seeing that there are lots of complicated sort of parameters to actually looking at the historicity of the figure of Jesus, it ends up devolving into a dialectic with one person on one side and the other on the other. And those sides are extreme. That either Jesus is a complete myth, there is no historicity to him whatsoever, or everything about Jesus has some historicity, and then go off and on and on and on, trying to relegate every element of Scripture to being something that's historical, instead of being able to accept and be, authentic about their approach to it, being honest about what's actually there, and much of which is not there, that we just don't know.
Well, there's groups where these people are there in fact, but the people that are in between, the ones that might have a little bit more nuanced opinion, they fall out of the discussion, and what's left is the extremists all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, John. That, like, most of the scholars in these sort of academic positions just, like I've written on my blog countless times, what most scholars, historical Jesus scholars, do is they try and profile Jesus. And that's the best they do. It's like, oh, Jesus was a philosopher, he was a prophet, or he was like this. And when it comes to like the facts, quote unquote, about Jesus, there's like 5 or 10 about in between that, what they establish, and that's about it. But unfortunately, this whole historicity debate, the people who are really invested in are the let's debunk Christianity, let's bring it to it, let's shake it to its knees, ha ha ha. And the people who defend it are like, no, let's bring the light of the gospel and prove that Jesus is God, and it just, everything in between, like we've talked about, just doesn't happen at all.
Yeah, the center falls out.
Yeah, and that's what I've always written about in my own thing with my own dealings with mythicism. I totally agree. Like, Paul doesn't say a lot about Jesus. Paul doesn't say hardly anything about Jesus. That's problematic. But I think he says enough to say Jesus existed. How much else? Well, you know, he lived and died, apparently.
That's the less than zero Jesus. That's what I would call that. A guy that was so obscure that even his disciples couldn't find him on Wednesdays, and yet he was the founder of a world-changing religion.
Well, yeah. Anyway, it's 10:17 in Kansas, so I need a hit the hay.
All right, Daniel, thanks for coming.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. It was really good. Considering we won't be probably here next week, I'm thinking. So
Yes.
I'm glad we went out with a bang.
Well, next time you see me, I'll be 1 year older. So.
Happy birthday.
Oh yeah, happy
Yes.
birthday.
Friday, 26th.
I'm sure you'll see me before my 54th, which is end of January. So hopefully you'll see me before that.
Okay. Catch you guys later.
Later.
Good night. I don't want to talk about Daniel's article about the brother of James, since he's not going to participate in the Hangout. So
Oh, okay, no problem.
we could switch to a different topic or continue what we were talking about, or whatever, call it quits, or whatever people feel like doing.
Well, I was just thinking, like, back to the cleansing of the temple thing. You know, a lot of people say we have multiple attestation for that, but it is kind of curious that we don't have anything outside of biblical tradition about that. And really, it's not mentioned in Paul's gospel, or Paul's epistles, is it?
Not that I know of.
Yeah, I don't think it is. But a lot of people say it's like it's a historical fact, but then there's no mention of something like that happening by anyone else, which that's a huge event, you know, that's a major thing, cleansing the temple. Being able to keep people from going in and out of either side of this huge building that had armed guards, etc. You know, we've talked about it before. So you could say you have multiple attestation within the Jesus tradition about this story, but it is a little weird, at least, that in this one case there's really nothing else besides that, besides the accounts within this tradition, you know?
Yeah, any kind of disruption in the temple might have not gone unnoticed. It's, you know, who knows, maybe.
Yeah, but we have historical records of other similar events happen, right? I mean, Josephus talks about at least one, right?
And then there's a reference, I think, in Luke, was it, where it talked about Pilate mixing the blood of the Galileans in the temple, something like that, that supposedly just occurred.
I don't remember that. What he's mixing the blood of what?
There was some kind of, it implies that there was like a rebellion of Galileans in the Jerusalem temple that he put down. Oh, I'll have to look it up for you.
Oh, okay. Anyway, yeah, the embarrassment thing with the crucifixion is interesting. Like, I do see the point to that. Like, I mean, if the dying and rising gods category isn't as well established as I've heard it
I
is.
think the gentleman's trying to point out the Luke 8:43 through 47.
Luke
I do
8.
believe so. Because that's the only mention in Luke about that. And about the cleansing the temple, if I might throw it in, not trying to be rude, just jumping in there. But if I'm not mistaken, in my personal belief and preference, when it's talking about cleansing the temple, I believe it is actually referring, in this instance, basically about our daily lives. We have so many things that are taking place that we just do not take the time to realize what the Lord has actually done. And He wants to keep our house clean, meaning our hearts clean, and yet we choose to keep doing things that are wrong. So, that may be wrong.
Well,
you're right, I don't
if
know.
you take it that
So-
way, then that's a legitimate way to take it. But it seems to me it just makes historicity less likely. If it's a metaphor or like some kind of like a parable or something like that, you know. Because we're trying to decide which events in Jesus' life did actually happen. Like if you went back in a time machine, you would actually witness these things happening.
Well, if you're looking at it from a, no offense, but a dogmatic point of view, then you're going to see every single one of them correct. But also, if you look at them as it as a non-Christian or an atheist per se, then you would find none of them to be true. So you got both sides of the perspective. Then you got the middle side, which is apparently, no offense to you, but where some people, and possibly you, stand trying to figure out which ones actually did exist. But the real question is not which ones did exist. The real question would more likely be, if they are true, then why are we questioning them?
Yeah, though I mean, I don't know. I think our approach is a little bit different. Maybe I'm not sure.
I mean, I could be wrong, but this is my personal opinion. But I could be wrong. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying my personal opinion is one of 7 billion on 7 billion on the earth. So
Yeah, we're just talking about a strictly what happened in history approach. That's all we're really talking about. And one of the criteria we were talking about was the multiple attestation, you know. And you know, if it really happened, you know, the temple is a gigantic compound basically, and it's even said in the account that they were able to prevent people from entering on the different entrances and exits. And I mean, you can't do that with one or two people. I mean, considering how huge it is, you'd have to have many people, and you'd have to have armed people because the temple was under guard, and there was a Roman fort right down the street full of guards. You know, and it's obvious why it was under guard, because I mean the bank, or not the bank, but the treasury was in the temple, so obviously it was under guard. So we're just trying to decide what it is the multiple attestation in the Gospels, leaving aside the question of its devotional meaning or what anything like that. That's a totally separate question. We're trying to figure out, like, does the fact that it's multiply or universally in this case attested in all four of the gospel traditions sufficient reason to consider it a historical event, even though there's not any other record of it happening outside of that tradition.
No, I'm not trying to sound dogmatic by no means, but I'm just curious with your statement you said of you're trying to, well, you all or some of you are trying to figure out whether or not it's in the Gospels and if it's actually relevant and actually did happen. Is that correct on your question?
Right, we're just doing just a strictly historical approach. What happened in history?
Correct. So, not like I said, not trying to sound dogmatic, but by the exact same token, wouldn't that be questioning what God's original plan was and questioning even if it did exist? Because if you're asking if it actually happened, that's kind of like me asking you if you're actually real, and then 15 years down the road, it says in a manuscript, hey, this guy existed and you don't have a birth certificate. Okay, I guess we got to figure it out by having a debate about it. So it either happened or it didn't.
Right,
I mean,
that's the
what to
question.
say other than the Word of God, and if you're going to rely on no offense to someone saying if they challenged this doctor, but my father has a doctorate degree as well. He's studied in a classroom in a church. No offense to some people that they studied just strictly in a school, but he has studied the Bible through and through, and he's written numerous books. But the reason why nobody cares about him is because he uses strictly one Bible, and everyone else says that the Bible he uses is the most incorrupt. Not trying to get off topic, but long story short, if it happened, then why are you trying to ask if it actually did happen, or why are you trying to figure out what actually happened? If it happened, it happened. That's my question.
Yeah, our whole approach for this hangout is not, it's strictly a historical approach. We're not discussing devotional aspects or faith aspects. They're not relevant to this hangout at all. They're separate. Just putting that out there, not to try and shut you down or anything, but they're not.
No.
We just don't deal with those issues in this hangout. That's all I'm saying.
I take no offense. Trust me, I've been in worse hangouts, or people are outright yelling at me, telling me to shut up. Trust me, I've been in worse.
Okay, yeah, no problem.
So,
I just wanted to
I'm
throw out.
not here to be rude. I'm not here to be facetious or anything else. I was just speaking my mind and speaking what I believe. And since you have said that, I will ask so kindly of apology. I apologize if you'll forgive me for intruding, but I was just giving my thoughts. So.
Oh, you don't have to
We
apologize.
never have problems with people that come in here and ask questions. I mean, it does not affect us in any way.
But since you did say that, I will back out, and I will allow you to continue your research, and hopefully you find a answer that you might be suited for.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for stopping in.
Thank you for your opinions.
So that was Luke 13:1, right? Yeah. Okay. So Doug, you don't remember that?
I thought he said it was Luke 8:43-47. The women
Well,
with
actually,
the issuance of blood.
It's Luke 13:1.
Oh, okay.
Blah blah blah. Okay. just starts off the chapter. There were present at that season some that told him of the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. And, that's just a very cryptic one-line reference. Nobody really is absolutely sure what that might be referencing. Some people have theories, obviously.
At that time, some people.
But I can't remember why we even brought that up.
Well, we were talking about the temple cleansing Pilate, and that it was curious that there's no external. I'm just trying to refresh your memory, throwing stuff out there of why we brought that up. I don't know.
Lost it. Maybe somebody else remembers. Seems so long ago. But one thing is interesting, though, is that this is, I think chronologically, this is after Jesus' cleansing. And then he mentions a really bloody supposed event that happened before that. Now, I don't know if there's any reference to this in Josephus or not. I thought there was, but it'd be kind of hard to find it, I guess.
That is really weird. Whose blood Pilate had mingled with the blood of their sacrifices.
Yeah, so it implies that there was the Pilate had just executed a bunch of Galilean rebels right in the temple area, and just right on the altars, kaplooey, a Mayan sacrifice.
And this is Luke 13. So this is right after the Jesus cleanses the temple, right? Because I see the parable of the fig tree.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that is a little odd, huh? Because how much time had really passed?
Not much.
And what's interesting is, if Pilate put down some disturbance in the temple, it sure as heck wasn't reported in the actual story itself in Luke or in any of the Gospels.
And
he basically just walks on out of there.
Yeah, and so Jesus comes in and creates a disturbance, and no big deal after something like that happened? You'd think that they'd be really touchy about things like that.
Well, it just seems impossible that it went down the way.
It kind of underlines the very, artificial nature of this concocted story here, because you're juxtapositioning events that should be one after another. It wouldn't make any kind of sense. Yet they're there.
Yeah. So what do you think, you and Reuben specifically, but you too, Kevin, if you have an opinion on it, or David, what do you guys think about the utilizing the criteria of embarrassment in regards to the fact that Jesus was crucified, or at least that he was killed, by Roman authorities?
Could you explain to me those criteria, exactly how that works?
Well, this one specifically is the criterion of embarrassment. So if you're looking at a historical text and something that's recounted within the text seems like it would be embarrassing to the author, the reasoning goes that it's probably more likely to be historical. Else, why would they put it in there? If it's embarrassing to the author.
That's assuming that the tendency is to minimize the bad and only emphasize the good when you're dealing with this type of writing.
Right.
Well, the reason why I would say that it might not hold water is that there's a whole host of elements within pretty much all of Christian teaching, which is evidence of cultural infiltration from non-Christian cultures. I mean, we've talked about this quite a bit. There are many things about the Jesus story which resemble other cultures that were already existing at the time. So, I mean, if this whole principle of embarrassment is the case, then where would they be redacting that? Where would they be kind of going back against what they were saying, trying to sort of cover it up or kind of diminish its power in the text?
Well, the reasoning goes kind of like if Jesus is purely mythical,
Okay.
why would they invent this story of him being in a very degrading way executed by Pilate? You see what I'm saying? That's how the argument goes. So they're saying, well, that they wouldn't have invented something like that.
They wouldn't
So
have invented. So a mythical being by default can't die.
well, that's I don't
But
think
usually
that's
the argument for historicity that
yeah.
you would Jesus has to be historical because what's said about him would be so embarrassing that no one would ever write something like that down about an actual person unless it was absolutely true and they couldn't deny it.
So
Right.
the crucifixion was applied as a way of sort of backpedaling on some of their own problems with it, or am I misunderstanding here?
Well, it makes it true as a criteria. The criteria of saying that the crucifixion story really happened, that Jesus really existed and really was crucified, is that nobody would make up such a degrading, ignoble, criminal-like death if it wasn't historically true.
Right. So therefore, the argument goes that because that seems so embarrassing to followers of this Jesus, and that it is in there, they put it in there, that it must be a historical event. Because why would they make something like that up? Not just that he died, but the specific way in which he died.
But
They could have made up anything.
Well, here's the thing. Just to use an example from my own tradition of something that's pretty ignoble, pretty atrocious, and a figure that actually did have a public cult at some point. Prometheus. I mean, he was one of the Titans who didn't fight in Titanomachy, and because he stole fire and because he defied Zeus, he was chained to a rock and had his liver pecked out for centuries until Heracles went into the underworld and freed him.
Now, what was the status of his reputation among followers of Greek religion? Was he a hero?
He created man.
But was he
his
considered like a
brother.
hero figure, basically? A good
Yeah.
guy?
Yeah,
Okay.
he was. He was. But he went through horrible, horrible pain and anguish.
So that just served, in that case, it seems like that embarrassing moment served kind of to honor him.
To remind
Prestige.
people that human existence is frail and that the very things that we have as means of survival, like that of fire, are a gift. But also, I mean, it's funny, the actual story of Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus is actually kind of interesting because Epimetheus gave all of the animal kind great power and strength and all of the best senses. And Prometheus created man in a very simple, kind of standard manner. And the only way that he was able to make men be able to fend for himself is by making them upright. So there's this kind of idea that Epimetheus is kind of adult, that he didn't realize what he was doing when he created man. There's different variations of the sort of creation of man story, and it's obviously entirely allegorical. But the point that I'm making is that if the whole aspect of embarrassment is not including things that are ignoble or seem to put the figure in question into a sort of shameful state, then what about all of the other mythologies around the world? And I'm just using Prometheus as one example. There are many, many others. Set is a perfect example of this in Egypt. His function in Egyptian mythology changed over the centuries. At one point, he was worshipped publicly, and in convening centuries, he became more negativistic in interpretation. They still worshipped him, but it was more of a sort of a distancing, like as in appeasement as opposed to actual devotion. And figures like this have changed throughout centuries in different cultures for similar reasons. So I'm kind of challenging the idea that every mythical figure that has some kind of divinity associated with them has to be always wonderful. Zeus slept around, and Hera was extremely jealous of him and did all kinds of horrible things.
Yeah, I guess the difference that I could see historicists arguing, I'm kind of in the middle on this. So I'm not necessarily. I'm just trying to play devil's advocate for the sake of moving the conversation along.
Of
But
course.
but I guess they would say that in the case of like I was thinking too while you were talking about Prometheus and the other people like of Osiris who pretty much underwent what you could call an embarrassing kind of death.
Yeah, he was castrated and dismembered and spread about the four
Yeah,
winds.
and
He
got
had to be put back, and not only was he
got
spread about,
tricked.
he had to be pieced together by women.
Exactly. Yeah.
He had to be pieced together by his sisters. Think about
And
that.
his replacement phallus was what, fish or something like that.
Something to that effect, depending on the
Yeah.
mythology and which kingdom you're speaking of.
But anyway, I could see like the counter to that would be, well, those stories are obviously mythical in that they don't have an obvious historical setting, whereas and I think they have a point to it.
You're right.
Because in the case of Jesus, there's an obvious historical setting. He's going around specific locales, talking to specific historical characters, at least Pilate. Although the portrayal of Pilate seems very unhistorical. But there seems to be a much more historically anchored setting. You see what I'm saying? So
Yes.
they would say, well, yeah, that's true in the case of myths, but here we're dealing with, it seems, the most you could say is it's a legend, not necessarily just raw mythology like in the case of Osiris.
There are examples in even other local non-Christian cultures of variant mythologies. I mean, there's the typical mythologies of the gods, but there are also sort of embellished or epic kind of mythologies, legends of particular figures that have tenuous historical understanding. For instance, the figure of Odysseus, the figure of Achilles in Greek mythology. They were likely based on somebody who existed, but they were given a sort of grandeur to them that was far more mythological in character and far more allegorical in content. Mm-hmm. But those were considered far more rooted in a history that probably existed, as opposed to, as I mentioned earlier, the concept of Dionysus kind of being reborn, being into the mortal realm and coexisting with man, teaching him wine, punishing impious and depraved individuals. So there's a lot of layer to that. There's a lot of gradations that exist in, depending on what mythology you're talking about and what culture. And we could obviously go into, Buddhist thought and their kind of concepts of the Buddhas, of Siddhartha. And we could also go into the concept of Krishna, who has a very similar concept to Dionysus, but also very different, contingent upon early Vedic and later Hindu religions. It's complicated.
Having you around, Kevin, because when you hear arguments of apologists who are trying to establish the historical Jesus, they don't have the background that you have in the classical culture, classical literature, classical myths, classical religion. So that's why I think it's really great that you hang with us, is because we don't want to get too narrowly focused and only looking at New Testament background, specific place, Palestine, that kind of stuff. We need that broader perspective.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think also as an extension of that, it's really very useful to look at all of the other contemporary traditions that exist, even if our framework of what Christianity is somewhat artificial. It almost is on a primary assumption that there was one Christianity. It seems that's what basically a lot of apologetics is, despite the fact that there were dozens of extra biblical texts that were left out of canon. We know that for sure. Unfortunately, many of them are fragmentary, or not properly translated, or were translated much later. Hence the reason that much of the church has said anything past, first to second century is completely null and void, and it has no purpose. But we don't know. Were those later translations? Were there earlier translations that existed before that? And in some cases, there seems to be evidence of that actually being the case. but in many of the instances, we don't really know what the original texts were. There are even ones that suggest there were some earlier than actually Christ's supposed birth.
Yeah, I mean, what I've always wondered, specifically in regards to the apocryphal stuff, a lot of it seems to be dated by mainstream scholarship to be, almost all of it seems to be late, like 2nd century and later.
Yeah.
But what I'm wondering is, how do they date? I mean, well, obviously you can date the manuscripts that we have, but how do they pin down the dating for the story itself? Do you guys know how they do that? Or, I mean, obviously if it mentions some specific historical event, that could help us pin it down.
A lot of the ways that I've seen
earlier than that, but
a lot of the ways I've seen comes down to language, the way it's written, the vernacular, the syntax, the semantics of language, these sorts of things.
Yeah.
But even so, like I said, and tying back to kind of my background in indigenous polytheistic traditions, most ancient cultures had oral dissemination of their myths, and they had multiple different versions of their myths in each culture. So why would Christianity be any different?
Right. Yeah. Well, that's the question. I mean, I don't think anyone doubts that there is an oral tradition, but the key question is, was there a historical event that kind of launched all the myth making afterward?
If it being written down is the only real solid criteria for canon, that actually calls Christianity largely into question, because then it's entirely pinned on who decided to write something down. Do we really know that the person who wrote it down was actually genuine in what they were writing, and that they were actually reflecting what was actually being practiced and what was being disseminated orally from person to person, family to family, or community to community?
Right. You're right. It all is the null hypothesis, if you will, is it's all under question, but that's where they bring in these criteria to try and decide, okay, well, here we have this story, or these stories that basically tell the same story. Obviously there's variation in details and timelines on certain things, but they basically tell the overall same story. But they say, well, what tools of historicity can we use to try and decide what, if anything, in these stories was actual historical events,
Well,
and that's where they bring up like multiple attestation, which I can see that's valid. I'm not sure if we actually have it in the Jesus tradition.
Multiple attestation is definitely important, but ultimately with any of these sorts of conversations, it's going to come down to two fields: archaeology and physical anthropology.
Those are clinchers, yeah, those are clinchers.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we really don't have anything that can weigh in one way or the other in the case of Jesus.
I feel that largely that's because of the bias of apologetics, because they want so intently for everything to be Christian in orientation. They don't want to have a holistic look of the ancient world at that time and other cultures. There are examples of other cultures referencing these sorts of ideas, but because so many of the people who are studying this have the bias automatically, they cannot suspend disbelief even for a moment that it's a historical, non-religious text. I mean, not to say that it's not religious in content, but they cannot suspend their own disbelief for the purposes of academia that it's not true.
And you had mentioned something like that along the same lines, I think, in the last Hangout we had. And like you said, it comes a lot from the arrogance that Christianity is the only true religion. You know, it's special. Its origins are special, and all that stuff. So they're coming to it with a preconceived bias already, where they cannot see it as being related to any way in anything else. Jesus' ethical teachings were unique. They had no precedents. Everything that happened to him might have been similar to something that happened in Greco-Roman myths, but it was totally unique in the case of Jesus. And it just goes on and on and on.
And the typical argument that I've heard with that, their sort of justification for the existence of other indigenous cultures having similar ideas, is that ultimately these people were ignorant and had some knowledge of what Jesus was before Jesus existed, which just makes you want to shake their head. I mean, it's just you realize these things were around 6, 7, 800 years before people even thought of the idea of Jesus.
Well, I mean, there are the things said by like apologists or maximal conservatives.
Yeah.
But then there are these people who I think are more of in an academic, like even atheists or agnostic academics like Bart Ehrman, who they have a minimal historical view. My real question is like, are the tools that are being pressed into service by these people? I'm just leaving like raw apologetics to the side because I don't even really consider that as a live option. But in regards to historicity, like, are these criteria really useful? I mean, and do we have them in the Jesus tradition? Like multiple attestation, I don't know. I think that's up in the air because I think even if all the Gospels were literarily independent, which we know the Synoptics aren't for sure, but even if John is, we still don't know if they. For all we know, they probably originate from some original oral tradition. So they're really not that independent. It's not like the New York Times reporting that George Bush was elected president, and then like the Portland Sun or whatever, I'm just making up papers, reporting the same thing. That's independent attestation.
Well, just as a sort of thought experiment here, let's just imagine that if Christianity developed in any different manner, to the extent that it was not entirely literalist, that it was not entirely absolutist, that it viewed itself more in the case of how some of the Gnostics viewed themselves, that it was a better truth, but not the only truth. It was a sort of special knowledge, which I'd mentioned before, the idea that effectively Christianity is a sort of mystery cult, like many other cultures would have been both at the time and previous to that. It is highly likely that the development of Christianity, though it may still have ended up similarly to how it has now with the imperial influence of Rome, it would have likely been more pluralistic. Pluralistic in the more denominational sense of like Hinduism, for instance, which has many different schools, each taking a different sort of aspect, but having this sort of presupposition that's all the same truth, ontologically speaking, cosmologically speaking, or whatever. But it didn't. So because of that, we have to backpedal. We oftentimes find ourselves applying modern understandings of religion, comparative religion, and the philosophy of religion to a tradition that developed so far removed from earlier religious concepts of such things. Like I said with earlier cultures, multiple myths in the same culture, multiple philosophical schools, multiple mystery traditions, all have variant sort of ideas that oftentimes were very departed from one another in actual core ethos, but still having the same primary framework.
Yeah. I guess the question is, I mean, it's all potentially legendary, but the approach is, can we figure out if anything in this tradition is historical? And what tools can we use to decide on that? You know what I mean? Yeah, say you're coming at it initially with just the default position that it's all legend. But then you just ask yourself, well, maybe some of it's history. How can we decide whether or not it is? And so, like, the principle of embarrassment is one of the things, and Daniel was saying that, that he thinks that the fact that Jesus died in this degrading way, crucified by Romans, the argument is, that's not something people would make up in a myth of a figure they wanted to worship. That's an embarrassing thing to make up. So therefore, since they report it, it's probably historical. But that's the argument. So I don't know, but
it's really difficult to come to those conclusions because, like I said, if you look at the extra-biblical, the heretical, heterodoxic kinds of versions of Christianity, they were even more vague. I mean, in some cases, certain Gnostics believed that Jesus existed in a sort of physical body, but not one that we would understand as physical. So they sort of call into question a lot of canonical understandings of Jesus being a literal, historical person, born into flesh, born of, Mary and Joseph and all that sort of thing, and down a particular line. Many of them almost were in antithesis to Judaism, whereas much of canonical Christianity tries to fuse itself with the Jewish concepts, overtaking them, subsuming earlier concepts of Jewish heritage and the ideas of sin and such like that. So if you were to really take a step back and look at all of the different Jesuses, there's just too much variation to go through and be able to conclude for certain what is historical about Jesus. We could certainly argue that he existed in some form, that he was likely a person, but does he reflect on anything in the actual stories?
That's
as good as mine.
Yeah, that's the question. I mean, I don't think any sober person is arguing that we can establish anything for certain, but yeah, I mean, they just want to decide what's most probable. But I wanted to get your opinion, John. What do you think about the embarrassment criterion when it's used on the cross, with the crucifixion? If you're still there.
The cat wanted to go out.
Oh, no problem.
Well, I was going to ask you, Doug, are you familiar with the contrary arguments to the criterion of embarrassment, say, like it's presented by Dr. Price?
Well, I'm not familiar with the details, but I remember, that's why I brought up the Jewish martyr, suffering servant idea, and then the dying and rising gods thing, but Daniel was saying that's not really a legitimate category. So I don't know. I'll have to read more about both of those things. But what Daniel said about the suffering servant idea, I think that's a strong case because, it did seem to be a reaction to something that was happening that they didn't like, and they were kind of trying to rationalize it. But anyway, go ahead if you want to tell me about them. I mean, I'm not that familiar with them, with the alternatives.
Well, I think I'll summarize as best I can. I'm not an expert on it, but here's my understanding of what he was saying: is that when you're writing these things down, you're creating this body of literature. You're going to be having people write certain things at a certain time that are not embarrassing to them. For instance, that Jesus came to be baptized by John the Baptist was not embarrassing to Mark, for example.
Right, doesn't seem to be.
But it was until the time of John, who eliminated the baptism altogether. So you have this body of literature where you're going to have certain things that are embarrassing to one group of Christians at a certain time remain in the literature and are embarrassing to Christians at a later time who try to downplay it or change it and so forth. And you're going to have stuff that comes in later on that's embarrassing to post-gospel Christians, that then have to deal with it apologetically in order to figure out, why that stuff is in there and explain it.
Yeah, now, how would that specifically happen in regards to, the way Jesus died? I can definitely see how it would work in the case of Jesus' baptism by John.
Well, you can look at it I think what Kevin was alluding to is that it's a process. It started, for instance, if you want to go all the way back to the beginning, with Daniel and his angelic son of man figure. Historically, that was an idea that continued to develop over time. Other writings came into play, for instance, the book of Enoch, which introduced a divine son of man. So there was a change in direction. Then along comes something like a book, The Assumption of Moses, which brings in another aspect of it. And then Isaiah comes in. So you're melding different concepts. You're melding a divine heroic figure, and you're bringing in elements of a heroic suffering figure. Now the binding theme is that both of them are representing Israel as something heroic, but it's a different take, and you have this dialectic tension between the two different representations. And as you move into the later era, you have these motifs already present, and you have to somehow work them out in dynamically in the religion itself as it has developed.
Yeah, I can see that happening, and I mean, if there was this idea of a heroic, suffering, divine figure, it seems like the more the figure suffered and was beaten down and harmed, that would make the denouement moment all the more powerful. The overcoming moment all the
That's what I
more
was getting from what
impressive.
Kevin was saying. Yeah, that
Yeah.
it's not something to be embarrassed about. It's actually what's edifying about the myth, and why it's not embarrassing to some people that their God would be crucified, died, because ultimately they would triumph, obviously, which was the ultimate myth.
Right, it's darkness before the light or whatever. But on the other hand, though, I can equally see someone did really die in this way, and this resurrection story and ascension into heaven, etc. That was all a later add-on to kind of rationalize this truly tragic event that did happen. Because I mean, we've seen examples of that too, you know.
Yeah, and that's a whole different body of thought about the same stuff. Yeah, it's like they interpreted an actual historical event in terms of these mythological themes that they inherited from, a long period of development. So, it's hard to say, which one is right. Was it purely mythical and it just was historicized because of all these motifs? Or did they have an historical person that they had to reinterpret their tragic death in terms that turned it into something heroic and glorious and triumph?
Well, I take it from a sort of different perspective. Also tying in some of the stuff that I studied from much earlier cultures than, the Greeks and the later Egyptians, but the earlier Egyptians, the Canaanites and the Sumerians, but also early Jews. If you really look at the whole body of kind of Abrahamic tradition, just to use that term, starting with Judaism and sort of ending with Christianity, you see a cultural mindset that's a peculiarity. A lot of, obviously, biased apologetics has this sort of idea, and you actually had a book up a few moments ago, the idea of revolutionary monotheism. This is something that has just plagued, comparative religion, and from the perspective of a polytheist like myself, I detest it, because it's this idea that polytheism is effectively a sort of primitivism. Whereas instead of doing that, just to use a funny little example here, we should really look at Abrahamism as the sort of David Bowie of religion, because it keeps changing. It keeps changing its sort of motif as it goes on, taking in various different ideas into itself. With Judaism as it started, it was likely started from an earlier polytheistic tradition, which became more monotric or henotheistic, and I would actually argue, this is from my bias, that it's still basically henotheistic, considering the fact that there are so many different other divinities that are a part of it, and it's definitely the case of Christianity too, if you consider the 9 orders of angels, which are generally considered somewhat apocryphal, depending on who you ask. But it's rooted in the historical aspect of a culture that was very, very hierarchical. Had a structure to it, a structure that not a lot of other cultures had to that extent, considering the fact that lay people could practice ritual, people were practicing more in their homes than in Jewish and Christian traditions. It was very much dependent and contingent upon a power structure of sages. A sort of, I'm trying to think of the term for it. It's not a theocracy. Help me if you can. It's a government run by the wise. There's a term for that in politics. But yeah, it's something to that effect.
Like a wise counsel or a philosopher king.
There's actually sort of like philosopher kings, but there's a concept of governments run by elders who are the wisest, and it tends to have a sort of religious, almost theocratic aspect to it, but it can be more secular in connotation. But that's very much how the early tradition developed. It became dependent entirely upon the rabbi. So going from there, the influence became more on mortals being the sort of source of authority. Scripture became more important, and I think as a result of that, deity became more monolithic, became more singular. They were a culture very much focused on itself, focused on the not pluralism, but unity of culture, unity of idea. And I think that colored a lot of the writings in the Old Testament and their relationships to other cultures. So you continue along that line, and you have this sort of tension of the underlying pluralistic element of basically all indigenous cultures. It starts to fracture, and you end up having all these mystery schools that were existing in and around the time when other cultures were much more pluralistic. So Christianity came out of this, kind of taking these different various elements and attributed them to historical figures who were basically the same kind of model as a rabbi. They were still kind of philosophers. They were still kind of these philosopher king type figures who were held to a particular esteem that is endemic to these cultures, to an extent that was not felt in other cultures. So they were already very isolated from themselves and from others.
And I can see what you're saying, because a lot of the way that other cultures' ideas and things came into Judaism leading up to Christianity was mediated by a very specific body of literature with very specific characters. You know, they had Daniel. Now, a lot of the ideas might have been Egyptian, they might have been Hellenistic, but they're coming into Judaism through a very narrow sieve where, okay, it's being attached to a Moses figure. He's very known. He's an insular kind of character that's only peculiar to Judaism. But these ideas are coming into Judaism mediated by these figures: Enoch, Moses, Isaiah suffering. So these are all, Jewish motifs, but that's the way that these other cultural ideas were being assimilated by the Jews, despite themselves, beside their insular and wanting to be separate character.
Yeah,
they're still getting them through that method.
And they were not just assimilated or incorporated from an exalted perspective, kind of exalting the core structure, rigid kind of understanding of what the Jewish identity was, but there's also denigrations of other concepts. If you really look at these exterior kind of fringe elements, like of demonology, for instance, you find that many of these figures that became demons, and in what we have, especially of the early church, there's remnants of that. These were deities from the ancient world that were contemporaries to Jewish people. They were Canaanite deities. They were Babylonian deities. They were of all different sorts of Near Eastern and even Egyptian and Greek deities. If you want any examples of this, go look into the Western esoteric tradition and the concept of the 72 goetic demons. Like those entities are intense. I mean, they go down into a very deep level of that sort of Jewish identity of being different than everything and better than everything, and that all of the rest is effectively evil.
Question for Doug: Are you familiar at all with Ehrman's use of the criteria of multiple attestation?
Yeah, I mean, I know he talks about stuff within the Gospels, and then doesn't he bring in outside sources too? Like he uses the quote unquote authentic part of the testimonium and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. But mainly his view is that it's not the Gospels themselves that are useful for attestation, because like most scholars in the academy, they've long ago recognized that, they're, I think there was a video somebody posted recently, maybe it was Bucky, that, just Ehrman just basically saying there's nothing, there's no evidence for the existence of Jesus out there, and just completely discounting the Gospels as being historical. But in Did Jesus Exist, for example, he goes into a lot of detail about the sources, like, for instance, Q as being one of the multiple attestations. So he's not saying the Gospels themselves, but the sources. Yeah, exactly. So I was just wondering.
That's problematic too. I mean.
Well, yeah, I was just wondering what you thought of that, if you're aware of that, and how he did it. But
yeah, I don't remember him using Q, but if he does, yeah, I don't consider that a strength.
And also special special Matthew material, special Luke material. He considers those separate sources from wherever they came from as also multiple attestations to historical Jesus.
Yeah, I don't consider that multiple either. The problem is that unlike other historical documents or accounts, this is a clearly theologically driven historical document. So everything in them should be suspect immediately, in my opinion. But anyway, did you hear what David and I were talking about on the side? Like, you talked about the development of the Son of Man thing, Daniel kind of talking about it, and then you have Enoch making it into a divine Son of Man, Assumption of Moses, etc., combined with the development of the suffering servant like Isaiah, and then 2nd and 4th Maccabees, etc. But when we look at the Gospels and the portrayal of Jesus, like David brought up the good thing about John's portrayal of Jesus' death versus the synoptic portrayal, like Mark, Jesus' death seems to kind of be not necessarily surprising per se to him, but, well, yeah, I guess unexpected. He seems shocked. But then you get to John. See, to me, John's account seems like more of what you would expect as the root earliest account if you had a development and creation out of this combination of the suffering servant, Son of Man idea. I'd expect something like John's Gospel.
Well, the idea of the suffering servant, I mean, it's a development of a development of a development of a development, tracing back to the earlier Jewish and sort of proto-Jewish concepts and their focus on the idea of almost like a sacred kinship, to use a more of a European kind of concept, that they're focusing on sons and fathers, but also how that ties into their concept of deity, and also how it ties into their concept of sacrifice. Obviously, you have the concept of I'm spacing out. Who was the son who God asked him to sacrifice? I'm having a space out. Abraham and
Isaac.
And Isaac. Thank you. So you have that is endemic to the Abrahamic concept of sacrifice. It's just that one story effectively colored everything else after it, that sort of surprise of the sacrifice is similar to the surprise that he didn't actually have to kill Isaac. But also this idea of Son of Man is very, very old. I mean, you have the concept of Elohim, which, and Reuben can attest to this, I've argued that it is a form of polytheism. The Elohim is plural. But also, if you do take that back to other cultures that were contemporary, like the Canaanites, pretty much all of their main deities were sons of El. Categorically, they were sons of El and Asherah. So this idea of a son of man is found as a heroic figure that was the son of a father deity, of a king deity. Like Marduk is another perfect example of this. And even demigods like Heracles, Horus being the son of Osiris. I mean, you see this everywhere. And
yeah, that part I don't have any issue with that part. That I totally see as something that's common. But when you look specifically at the trajectory through the gospel tradition,
Yes.
rather than going from what you just described to a more historicized version, you actually get the opposite. You go from less divine, a death that's not expected necessarily, and you go toward the Gospel of John, which ends up being Jesus is fully divine. His whole purpose for coming to earth was to die. Everything is planned out just to be like that. That's the most heroic Jesus figure, the Gospel of John. But that's the latest one. So what I'm saying is, if Jesus was mythical and the idea of Jesus rose out of these dual ideas of the divine Son of Man and the suffering servant, I would expect something like the Gospel of John to be the earliest, and then a trend of historicizing after that. But then John and I have talked about this too. Like, this is one of the big problems with mythicism, that you have to posit that there was a mythical form that got historicized and then got re-mythologized. So I guess we're just looking at the second half of that stage, going from history to mythology. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I forgot about that.
Let's look at it really simply here. Okay, if it was originally a myth, and that, as I used with the thought experiment, it would have developed in almost a sort of Hinduism. It would have been paganistic in character, as less Hellenistic in character, using Hellenistic to describe more the mystery cult aspect that I discussed before. It was a myth that was made historical. Well, let's look at the area and look who was in power at the time. Rome. Rome was very much about the imperial cult, and whether implicitly or explicitly, the worship of an actual historical figure, the emperor. So this idea of kingship, of rooting oneself in the actual physical kingdom, the physical empire of man, it would have been an easy transition from taking a myth and integrating it into basically a new form of the imperial cult, which effectively was what happened. Now you take that as something that sort of happens more qualitatively in the incorporation of Christianity into the church, whether at the actual time in which these events were supposed to have occurred or shortly afterwards. The re-mythization of that was the reaction to the death, the reaction ideologically and doctrinally to that death, making sense of that with the various different councils of the church. They were trying to reintroduce myth to it in a way that was concurrent with how they defined canon. So that's where you get all of that weird sort of progression going on, and the way in which the various Gospels were put into their proper context.
Yeah, but I think even through canonization, I mean, you have the mainstream conservative Christian approach to looking at the Gospels and the canon, and they try and iron out all the differences. But even the stuff in the canon, there's big differences. Like, I see the Gospel of John, and a lot of people see it as there's obvious Gnostic themes in the Gospel of John, almost undeniable.
Well, you ever heard of a jimmy rig before?
A jimmy rig?
Yeah, when something doesn't really work all that well, you don't have all the pieces, like your
Oh,
IKEA
sure, yeah.
you picked up at the store.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is I don't think the process of canonization was necessarily so designed per se.
It was arbitrary. They chose
exactly. So what we ended up
Constantine.
with was quite a variety of Christianity, even within the canon. Although Christians looking at the canon now have basically flattened out all that variety, and they've taken the parts that they really like, and they've interpreted everything else in that framework, so that all that variety is gone. But it's actually really there.
It's already been watered down. It was watered down by Constantine, who took 30-some Gospels and 4. So from that 4, then people can kind of just separate. It ends up being watered down completely, and it loses its original meaning entirely.
there's that body of scholarship that thinks that the Christology of John is actually very old, and it's just a historical accident that it might have been written down into a gospel after all the other ones, but it might actually reflect an earlier view of Jesus than you would suspect if you're just looking at history chronologically.
Yeah, and likely it would have reflected a completely divergent school of thought on it. But we don't have enough on it to actually make sense of a sort of Johnian, if that's even a word, Johnian form of Christianity.
Well, that makes what you said is even more.
I'm sorry, Doug, you're breaking up.
I think I was getting an echo. It's better now. What you said is really interesting when you apply Bultmann's idea. If if John's portrayal is very ancient, could John's gospel be a reaction to the synoptics, basically saying like, no, this is what really happened. This is how. This is you know what I mean. Like, here are these synoptics who are trying to historicize this actually much earlier, more mythical presentation, and John saying, "What are you guys talking about, Matthew, Mark, and Luke? This is really the story of Jesus." But then again, the whole idea of the Paraclete coming after, and I don't know, there's stuff in there that seems to be like it's later too. So I don't know.
If you look at what Constantine was doing, and a lot of the people that followed him, they were trying to not only relegate those sorts of things to the kind of embarrassment concept of trying to kind of do damage control of the things they didn't like. They were also trying to take things that they didn't like, because this is what Rome did. They took things that they kind of didn't like and made it theirs. They changed it around so that it was acceptable, if that makes sense. So taking something they don't like and reconfiguring it or readdressing it in a manner that was consistent with what they were trying to do. They exploited it. And I think that's probably what they were doing with John.
Like what they did basically with the Pauline corpus, they made it their own, where it was previously used extensively by what they would consider heretics. They just appropriated it with a few changes.
What they were doing with Christianity in the first place.
Yeah.
Right? That's why they adopted it, right? We're being honest here. That's why Rome adopted it. Not necessarily people who were practicing Christianity, but Rome. So, to say that a canonization was not arbitrary is kind of facetious.
I like what you said about the imperial cult, because I just brought up something that I was thinking about from last week, where we were talking about how I convinced Dr. Price that the term gospel in the Gospels, the good news, he was usually translating it as just the news based on some scholarly perceptions. And I said, well, there's some inscriptions, some column inscriptions, I believe, when it's talking about Caesar Augustus. And a lot of the language that was used to describe Caesar was very reminiscent of the early parts of each gospel, where it even uses the word evangelion as part of the good news of Augustus's reign. So my point that I told Dr. Price is that at some point, Christians felt safe enough to appropriate that kind of imperial cult language and concepts, felt safe about incorporating it into their religion of Jesus. And that's why you should still think of it, the term evangelion, as still good news, gospel, because that's the way it was being used as far as Augustus was concerned, and it was applied to Jesus, and it still had the same force and same meaning.
Evangelion. That.
Right, yeah.
See the emphasis? The diacritics?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Great pronouncer.
Remember, the G is a GY. Does it make sense? Like when you order a gyro, you're ordering a hero.
Right.
Yeah, that's the way I pronounce it. I don't say gyro.
Hero. It's almost like a GYH. It's peculiar. It takes practice.
I'm gonna have to read more about this. Who can I read, John, about the possible ancient pedigree of John's Gospel's portrayal?
Geez, I think Dr. Price told us a couple hangouts ago, maybe if you looked at one of those hangouts, but I can't remember the actual scholar's name.
Okay,
If
I'll
if
look
somebody
into it more.
mentioned it, I'd say, oh yeah, that was him, but I can't remember it offhand.
Yeah, the only thing that I think, I don't know, I'm trying to think about that. I'll have to like read them all again and keep that in mind while I'm reading them. Because there does seem to be stuff in there that seems like, he knows the author seems to like know he's coming on the scene after, you know what I mean? The corrective stuff, and then the whole, oh, Paraclete's going to come and give you the true teaching,
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
One thing, though, I have a problem with is thinking of myth to historical back to myth. To me, it's more like divinely worshipped figure that probably came from various outside influences, also indigenous, like Canaanite polytheism strands running through Judaism. That was like, rather than a myth, I'm thinking a pre-existently worshipped divine figure of some kind who then becomes historicized, rather than a myth becomes historicized.
Oh yeah, there's definitely pre-configuration of the Jesus myth. There are other deities that absolutely have some of those qualities, but you see the difference, and largely for that sort of like reinvention aspect, that they were trying to make something. They were trying to be unique in some respects, while still taking the sort of earlier concepts. A lot of the sort of sons of God kind of concept, these treasured sons of the higher God, of the sort of paterfamilias. They were almost always warriors, like Baal Hadad, Baal.
That's why I think they chose Yeshua, Joshua. That's why I think that became like a title for this divine being, is because of that warrior quality of the biblical Joshua.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So largely, and I've made this sort of this aspect before, that the figure of Yeshua is actually far more Hellenic, or at the very least Hellenistic, than he is Jewish. The kinds of figures that, and not even just taking it from a sort of comparative religion perspective, but from a contingent Jewish perspective. Thank you. What were the Jews saying was going to be their salvation? A figure who would come in on horseback and armor. That was their savior. Somebody who's going to come in and wreck shit. Not Jesus.
Right, but might you be able to say that concept of the divine warrior is a figure of all polytheism, not specifically Hellenistic, but it could have come in from, say, like Canaanite mythology and that kind of.
No, I think you're misunderstanding me a little bit. What I'm saying is, yes, the divine warrior is definitely a concept that exists in all mythologies, but a peculiarity of Greek, though, one of the sorts of exceptions to that rule, is that many of their most highly worshipped deities, male deities, were less warrior-oriented. The figure of Ares had a certain taboo associated with it.
I did misunderstand you.
Yeah, and even the deities that were associated with war also had more sexual elements to them, had more wisdom elements associated with them. Like Athena is fully armored, but she's associated with wisdom. They were very much
more like Jesus.
Now the figures that are more like Jesus, Apollo, Dionysus, Hermes, a lot of these like powerful deities that had mystery traditions associated with them were less that way. They were less militant, less militaristic. They were more subdued. Their domains were more about wisdom and illumination. They were more about sacrament and mysticism and all these sorts of things. So those ideas were already present in the culture that adopted Christianity, that made it the standard of religion.
I don't know. I think I might have said this before because it sounds familiar to me, but there's also evidence of multiple Joshuas there's a Joshua the warrior, but there's also Joshua the consecrated priest, the one that Moses said, carry on, and kind of like, okay, what about Aaron? Well, he was in a different tradition.
Yeah,
it's the
that's true.
melding of different things. So there could have been also a less warrior type of Yeshua
Well,
figure.
just use an example of somebody that's nuanced in that respect that you're just describing, Apollo. Okay, many of the Greek deities had their own chariots. There was particular. They almost always had a sort of authority that was associated, had a militaristic aspect. Apollo, even though it was more associated with music and illumination and things like that, both him and his sister could string a bow. So Apollo was often featured both with the lyre, the hand harp, and also with the bow. So there's a dual aspect to many deities throughout the world in various different mythologies. It was very rare, in fact, for any single deity to be completely relegated to a very narrow domain, culturally, liturgically, mystically, or any of those sorts of things. And especially with the Roman Apollo, Apollo versus Apollon, the Greek form. He was more associated with the sun, and Apollo actually was a little more aggressive in Roman period. The way that the Romans saw him was more with his aspect of being both life and death, and the sort of raw power of illumination of the sun. He was much more of a solar deity in Roman times.
So maybe that influenced some of the apocalyptic views of Jesus, the conquering warrior of the eschaton.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's fascinating.
Actually, Helios and Apollo are almost the same deity in Rome. Helios is the Titan associated with the sun.
Yeah, I have to make a quick trip to the facilities. I'll be right back.
All right, see you in a bit. Everyone likes classical music, Doug. Come on now. Especially when somebody's trying to talk. You still there, Doug? Ah, looks like he went B or burb.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry.
House.
Where'd you guys leave off?
We were sort of talking about the idea that I sort of proposed that the figure of Jesus is more of a Hellenic one. And we were sort of going into the reasons why. A lot of the sons of God's figure, the son of like the paterfamilias in most mythologies, the sort of treasured son, an example of that. Another one that I haven't used is, Thor to Odin. Thor being the son who's the champion of both men and the gods. See how this kind of similar kind of concept, Odin being the All-Father, is usually associated with some kind of war aspect. But in Greece and a lot of Rome, despite their more militaristic aspects, a lot of their treasured sons of their main deity had less of a military influence.
Oh yeah, I heard that part.
Yeah. So we were just sort of going into the aspect that Apollo is a perfect example of that. I don't know if you caught that part. But he has a very dualistic aspect associated with both life and death, shown carrying a lyre, but also the bow, like his sister Artemis. So he was very much a sort of Renaissance man, very much like the figure of Lugos in Celtic mythology, or Lu in Gaelic mythology. Kind of was able to do pretty much everything, but was also very charismatic and very kind and compassionate, associated with illumination and wisdom. Now, the thing that makes Jesus less that way, though, is his association seems very, very much so with fish, with fishing, with the actual symbol that many early Christians used, the ischus, the fish, the Jesus, basically kind of an anagram of Jesus.
Like Dagon.
Yes, you actually caught on exactly what I'm talking about. Dagon is a Canaanite deity who is associated with more agrarian and agricultural aspects, but also had very much of the same kind of peaceful male energy to him, if that makes sense. But there were other deities like that as well that were associated with this sort of fertility. But I think that largely has to do with the differences between Levantine culture and more northern Mediterranean cultures like the Greeks and the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
But you already knew that.
There's a lot of acceptance of dualism as part of the natural order, but it seems to be resisted very strongly in, say, as a representative example, Judaism.
Yes. Well, that's what happens. The more centralized your theology and your mythology and your ontology becomes, the more dualism is sort of guarded against, because it's viewed as a sort of like slippery slope, in the way that sort of in Pythagorean thought you have the monad, but then you also have the duad and the triad, and it creates that sort of tetraxis, the sort of emanation of centralization of deity into the lesser forms. And that aspect is probably what helped to create a lot of Trinitarian thought, was those earlier Greco-Roman, or at the very least Roman, versions of earlier philosophical schools existing in the area.
I've heard too that the whole Trinity idea may have come out of different forms of Hinduism too. I guess they had a kind of a Trinity idea.
That is a Pandora's box, my friend.
Yeah.
the influence of the East on the Mediterranean is extensive. I mean, many of the writers of the earlier Greek myths were cited as actually taking inspiration from the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and various different Buddhist and Hindu cultures. There is actually a period in ancient Greece, in like 500 and 600 BC, called the Greco-Buddhist period. The Greeks were influencing a lot of Buddhist culture, and actually produced a lot of some of the very Western-looking kind of sculptures that you saw from that period. But also the Greeks were taking a lot of ideas from the Buddhist and Hindu cultures. And obviously, I'm sure you're well aware of the sort of tenuous interaction of Alexander with India and not wanting to go there.
Yeah.
Trying to conquer them, and like, nope, I can't do this. But from a philosophical and religious perspective, a lot of exchange was going on. It's been suggested that Neoplatonism, some of those Hellenistic one of those Hellenistic schools that existed, was greatly influenced by Eastern thought, as well as as more of the Semitic kind of concepts, especially Christianity. Later forms of Neoplatonism are far closer to like Gnostic Christianity than they are to Greek religion.
It seems impossible to deny because of the trade that was going on. They're importing goods from as far away as China into the Middle East, and to deny that there was more than just goods, but also ideas going back and forth, seems to be really living in denial.
There's a quote by one of the Greek philosophers, as well as Lao Tzu. It's the exact same quote. Change is the only constant.
Oh.
There was exchange going on. They had a lot of very similar ideas. It wasn't just coincidence.
Yeah, I mean, I think the influence of the Eastern, specifically Indian religious ideas is just kind of breaking through. That they played a big part as well, not just Greek and Egyptian and mystery cults, stuff like that,
Well, to use as an example, since he's commonly correlated with the figure of Jesus, Dionysus. It is well understood from within that culture that Dionysus was the penultimate exotic deity within the core pantheon. Go ahead.
Didn't Dionysus have an Egyptian origin ultimately? Wasn't he like a version of Osiris?
it's been associated that way. But an example of how it's clearly from different cultures. One of his main animal associations, his animal symbols, was the leopard. Think about that for a second. Greece, leopards.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a lot of stuff going on. And a lot of the symbols that were associated with Dionysus seem to be imported from various different cultures. The thing that's particular to the Greeks, but also the later Romans who took it even further, is the idea of cultural integration and culturalization, specifically, and what has been called is Hellenization. The Greeks were notorious for taking other ideas and making them authentically Greek. They would take ideas from many different cultures over centuries and make them a part of their own culture, consistently a part of their own culture with their own language and their own trappings, while still having echoes of the cultures they took. The Greeks were also well known for having a sort of frenemy relationship with various other cultures. They greatly appreciated the Babylonians and the Egyptians, but were also fucking scared of them, and sometimes actually hostile towards these other local cultures. Same with the Phoenicians. Same with the East.
Canadians.
Yep, exactly. It's like how we see Canadians. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think all these
Graphic sound is
influences.
weird, but you know what that reminds me of is the sound that aliens are making in Signs. That movie with what's his face? Yeah, it's kind of like that baby monitor sound.
Yeah, I think what Daniel was saying, I like that idea that they weren't just picking different pieces up here and there, consciously going, oh, we're going to make Jesus like this guy here and like this guy there and blah, blah, blah. I think it was more of an unconscious type of influence. But yeah, I definitely see that they're there for
Well,
sure.
think about this for a second. I mean, think about this. If you're an artist, you draw, you make music, or whatever the case may be, over a long period of time, you're unconsciously picking up inspiration from various things. You may consciously go out and expose yourself to other things, but likely you're unconsciously integrating or incorporating some of those concepts and those motifs. I think that's a really good word to sort of describe that. Those motifs are taken even just by you as an individual. Now imagine many, many different people over centuries. That's a lot of different things going on all at the same time over a very, very long period of time. So to suggest that those cultures didn't have those sorts of motifs incorporated, yeah, that's just nonsense.
Yeah, I think probably only. Sorry, John.
Oh, no, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think probably only like apologists would argue that there's just no influence at all. As Dr. Price says, that they argue that Christianity and Judaism were hermetically sealed off from the entire outside world. That seems crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I kind of lost track of the general arch of our conversation, so I don't know where to go.
Well, one of the things that Kevin was saying reminded me of the case of plagiarism that George Harrison went through with My Sweet Lord. If you listen to that song and you listen to the Shirelles' He's So Fine, it's like they're basically identical, and you would wonder how the heck could you write a song and not realize that something was that similar. But that's a lot of times it's not just unconscious or well, it is unconscious, but the extent of your influences coming out in various manifestations can be very similar to what went in. So your influences can actually come out in the same way that they went in, and you just don't even realize it. And that can happen culturally and socially too, I think.
Yep.
Because you're raised in those things. You're raised around those different cultures and those different ideas and motifs. As a sort of experiment for like a little like a writing project of my own some years ago, I tried creating a mythopoeia, kind of in the same sense of like Tolkien or like the writer of Conan the Barbarian, creating a sort of fantasy mythology. And I just wanted to see how it would be to write something like that. So I wrote, a good, 10 or 15 pages of it. And when I read it, I was like, wow, this is a lot like Greek mythology. I wasn't trying to write Greek mythology, but that's what it came out.
Yeah.
that's where a lot of my point of reference has been for years. That's what led me to my current path. So, you know, you have to look at what the influences of those artists were. You know, the people who were sitting down in candlelight with large pieces of parchment and a quill and ink, what were they thinking at night when they were writing these things, or even during the day in seclusion? You know, the mind's a funny thing. When you stimulate that aspect of the mind, there's a lot of unconscious things that come out that you're not even aware of. Now, just imagine many different people writing different things, and then these different artists kind of come, well, what does this mean exactly? What's a better way to write this? You know, that's what I'm saying is we need to take it back down to the human element. We need to look at, like, anthropologically, what it would have been like to write the Gospels. That's a conversation that rarely happens.
I think Dr. Price mentioned that one of his exercises when he was actually teaching was to have his students write their own gospel as an exercise.
Absolutely. I wanted to try that.
Yeah, I always want. You know, a lot of times when I wrote science fiction when I was a kid, you know, I'd let people read it, and it's like, okay, so this is like Star Trek, right? And it's like, okay, when you look at it, I'm thinking, yeah, it is way too much like Star Trek. So you could tell where my influences were coming from and spilling back out.
And do you think the first thing you wrote would have been the only draft? You know?
That's true, yeah. Yeah, some things went through too many drafts. They never actually got finished.
Yep. I've always been a fan of practical, real-world examinations, actual experimentation. And it's unfortunate that a lot of humanities subjects don't get that kind of rigorous experimentation, or rather, this sort of fun exploration of experimentation. Actually enjoying it, having a good time, actually being able to get into these aspects of what? Critical thinking. That one thing that teachers hammered it in our heads for years and years. Anyone who's been to college. Sorry if I cut you off, Doug.
Oh, no, you didn't, no.
I thought it was you, maybe John.
Nope, I was done.
Okay. Yeah. So but like I said, that's just kind of how it is with a lot of that stuff. The context of myth with you know Christian doctrine is very different. I mean, if we were approaching almost any other religion in this conversation, it would be much different. We would come to this sort of conclusion: oh, yeah, they're likely symbolic with lots of cultural influences, and it was written at a time for these particular reasons, and some of their ideas are pretty archaic, but they didn't take all of those ideas as word. Whereas with Christianity, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, they do.
Yeah, well, in a lot of cases, you wouldn't get people agreeing with you either to be attacking about now.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not to say that those things don't exist in other traditions. Using as a template, as a continuous tradition of a non-Christian, non-Jewish, non-Muslim type, Hinduism. There's a lot of infighting in Hindu tradition. There's a lot of infighting among Hindus. So that kind of takes back to what I was saying before, the sort of anthropological aspect, what all humans do when it comes to media, when it comes to religious doctrine, philosophical, political ideas, cultural mindsets, and cultural interactions. They're effectively the same. It's a science, you know?
Oh, that's totally cool. I'm kind of talked out.
I got you. I just wanted to drop in and say my piece and talk some ideas with you guys.
Yeah, we appreciate your you have a different perspective from a lot of us because, like John said, we're not as studied up on the Greek mythology and all that stuff. So it's nice hearing a different approach to all this stuff.
Well, I always read all around. I don't just focus on my own tradition. And in fact, I have several books on Canaanite polytheism. Good stuff.
Awesome.
Yeah, the actual tradition.
Biblical scholarship can get pretty insular, it seems like, and be self-contained.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of it has to do with me is like what I can get book-wise, what I can afford, what I can get free, and what software I got. There's just not a lot of Canaanite software out there.
Yeah.
Fortunately, there are some dictionaries out there. I know a few for Akkadian. I know a few for Canaanite. There's actually a really good book. I need to find it again. It's actually a study on Ugaritic to learn the language. It's brown with gold lettering. I had it once. I actually ended up donating it to a library. Should have kept it. That's the way I went with books. My mother always taught me a book is never a wasted investment if you read it. And as an extension of that, a book is always a great gift. So I've given away a lot of books that I have, that I've read 1,000 times. You know, like, this is a really cool book. You should read it. Here, it's a gift to you. Knowledge.
Yeah, they are
Good
great.
choices are not always appreciated.
The people I give it
Give me
to
that
always
for.
appreciate it. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, a lot of people help themselves to my books too, because I always wonder whatever happened to that. Anyway, I usually only can be able to go till around midnight anyway on these school nights, but soon the kids will be on vacation.
I'm not
So.
looking at the screen.
What was that?
Are we still live?
Yeah, we're still live.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I found the book before you leave. I will send you guys the link. It's called A Primer on Ugaritic Language, Culture, and Literature by William Hay Schreindevund and Joel M. Hunt. Probably
Cool.
butchered that guy's name, but here's the link.
Oh, cool.
I'll check it out.
It's intense.
To me, like, I'd love to learn Ugaritic, but I think I need to learn German because there's so much untranslated scholarship that I'd like to read.
German and French.
Or Dutch too. There's the Dutch Radical School that I'd like to read. Then maybe Ugaritic.
Well, if you learn Ugaritic, also learn Hebrew because they're very similar. They're cousin languages, totally.
Mm-hmm.
Phoenician's a little different, but that was like a later development. It's mostly the alphabet and a few grammatical changes.
Canadian.
Mm-hmm. So
Yeah, I had no plans to learn Canadian, but Ugaritic was good.
yeah, I know. That's how you know you're a history geek. Should I learn this ancient language or?
Yeah, that's sometimes pretty sad. Kevin, did you see that one video that's been going around? It's a song called, what is that? The Model of a Biblical Philologist. And it's basically set to the tune, Model of a Military Major General. And it goes through all kinds of crazy stuff that most people never heard of. I dream in, what was it?
Flowery Acadian.
Yeah, and all kinds of stuff. He knows all the symbols of the apparatus criticus. And just all the very obscure stuff. I mean, if you get a chance to see that, it's hysterical.
Throw the link in there. Yeah.
What's up?
Yeah, I don't have it handy.
This video, the biblical philologist.
Gotcha. I think I will save this link for myself for later. I actually have a whole folder for Near Eastern stuff, so just gotta find it. Alright, got it.
Well, I have some homework. I got to read more about Dying and Rising Gods category.
Mm-hmm.
I got to read more about the scholars who are arguing for an older pedigree to John's portrayal of Jesus. What else do I have to read about? I don't know. I'll figure it out, I guess.
Take your time with it and have fun with it. If you're not having fun, you're not doing it right.
I do, for sure. But these are pressing questions in my head now.
You geek.
Yeah.
Well, one of the lines in that song is that he can prove that the Phoenicians were most assuredly Canadian. So
Yeah.
I suggested in the end of Sunday's Hangout when we were offline is from now on, whenever the word Phoenician comes, just say Canadian, but
Yeah,
don't
we'll just
explain it, don't mention it, just do it.
Oh, it all makes sense.
Explode.
It all makes sense. It all makes sense now. I'm half Canadian, so I'm actually Phoenician. All right, cool. That's where my last name comes from. My great-grandfather was French-Canadian.
What's your last? Oh, Seguin. Is that how you say it? Seguin?
My family says Sigouin.
Seguin?
In Paris, they would say Seguin.
Seguin. Okay.
Seguin. It's the nasal N.
It's not related to Sagan, is it?
No, actually, it's rooted in ancient Visigothic, Sigivin, meaning victorious friend.
Oh, cool. You know, I found out my first name, Douglas. It's Gaelic. I didn't know that. It means like dark stream or something like that.
Yeah.
Or at least that's what those really hokey, popular, what is your naming website told me.
Hold on a second.
Probably means something totally different.
Doesn't it come from like Douglas with a D in Gaelic? It's not an actual G.
No, I don't remember. It just said, I don't even know if it said, it just said, it had my spelling and then gave a definition.
Because one of my hobbies is researching the name Douglas. I don't know why.
That's really weird.
Douglas, anglicized form of the Scottish name Douglas, meaning dark river, from Gaelic dub, dark, and glas, water or river.
Ah, yeah, so they were right.
Douglas was originally a river name, which then became a Scottish clan name belonging to a powerful line of Scottish earls. It has been used as a given name since the 16th century.
Yeah, I thought the original form was like Dougal or something like that, because Dougal is a Scottish name, but I guess it must be Dougal.
No,
Dougal. All must be something different.
It's dark and water.
Yeah.
Two Gaelic words.
Okay.
Yeah, just Google it next time.
Google it. Oh, I'm gonna start a competing search engine now.
I was born in North Dakota. I'm adopted, and my mother was half French, half Sioux. And my father was 100% Mormon.
Yeah.
So I was adopted into the Felix family. Actually, they changed their name. It was Furlick, which is German, sometime just before World War II, because my dad was in grade school as Furlick, and by the time he went in the Navy, he was Felix. So I think they just wanted to change it so it's not to sound German during World War II or leading up to it. So, but it's a big mystery. No one wants to ever tell us. You know, the elders of the family ever want to reveal exactly why they made the change. But you know, it causes a lot of problems that they Latinized it, because I constantly get calls that are Hispanic, assuming that it's a Spanish household.
Felix?
Yeah, there's a lot of Hispanic families that have that as a surname.
Speaking of that with my surname, it's Visigothic, right? The Germanic cultures much later, they came down in like the 14th century into southern France, which is more of a Gallo-Roman stock. But they also settled in northern Spain. So there's actually a city in Texas, Seguin, which is what most people call me on the phone for some reason, because they think it has an accent of the I, which doesn't.
That's how I thought it was.
Yeah, it kind of looks like it is.
Well, they're basically the same name. There's a Spanish version, and then there's a French version. Actually, there's 4 French versions. There's the sort of Siouin, there's Seguin, and Seguin. It's fucking bullshit. But it's like the Smith of France, I'm told. Like it's a really common French last name. So I'm not special. Even though my mother told me I was.
Not as common as Bonaparte. Oh, that was Italian accent. What am I doing?
Bonaparte.
I'm not proud of is that I had French in grade school, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. Then I had 3 years of it in high school and 1 year of it in college, and I barely remember a single thing about it.
Je parle un peu français.
See, I don't even know what that
You
is.
speak a little French.
Yeah, just a little.
Not even that much. It's like it was completely erased by some chemicals or something that just did a brainwash.
It's called disuse.
Je m'appelle Kevin Seguin.
Use it or lose it, right?
Yeah.
How often are you going to get to use Ugaritic? Probably never.
I don't know, man. That's some sexy
Maybe there's
shit.
Ugaritic speakers hangouts. Speak Ugaritic to each other.
We have to speak like dead Middle Eastern languages, like Near Eastern languages. Ugaritic, Akkadian, Hittite, Canadian. Ridiculous.
Well, watch that video that I put the link to, and
Yeah, it's really
you'll
fun.
really enjoy it. Anyway, I gotta say goodnight. I gotta get to sleep.
Okay. Take
All
care.
right, see you, John.
Alrighty, man. Thanks for stopping by. It was a very great hangout. I really appreciate it.
Yep, it was fun.
And if Reuven's still alive or awake or whatever he is, he can go offline if he wants.